Hello, Ivy here. This week's podcast is a short recap of the previous episode with the title of A Carefully Managed Public Mask. That episode is very much linked with today's episode, entitled The Cost of Emotional Containment. The remaining 4 episodes are all linked, and the final episode will provide plenty of evidence gathered and discussed over the 6 podcasts that the actions or lack of actions over a very long period, combined with effort being placed on the wrong areas of the huge risks to the Crown. The phrase risks to the Crown is the arc that covers all 6 areas of discussion, with each point based on evidence and published research data. Due to illness, episode 179 did not have an article published. Please accept my apologies for that. I have now completed a combined article of episodes 179 and 180, which looks at the UK monarchy and the clear evidence that some members of the British royal family are clearly hiding behind a public mask. A mask which is trying to say all is okay, when I believe that the opposite is true. Episode 180 has the title of The Cost of Emotional Containment, and we will explore the dangers of that process and the impact on mental health and the ripple effect of risk to the Crown. The monarchy currently lacks leadership, and the future does not bode well, that things are likely to get any better. It is being in denial with an increasing tension between the top 2. But in my mind, neither one of them is grasping the risks of the game playing. I have researched some of the risks to the Crown, or the perceived risks to the Crown. The Crown as a structure and institution, and all the stakeholders who want it to stay in place, not least because they receive a wage for their efforts. What would they do if the Crown failed? History has shown us over many years that when the monarchy goes internal with their activity and give out a public persona, etc., it always ends badly. The erosion begins from within, out of sight, but the inevitable always happens. I have used research examples from recent and past papers to ensure that I do not just state my opinions. I have listed behavioural traits on display by the lead players in UK monarchy, and that also does not bode well. The risks to the Crown that they claim to love so much is in danger, and I do not think enough thought has been given to the implications. I am not a royalist, but I am being careful to use research data and not just state my opinion, or worse, rely on tabloid fodder, which in itself has different goals in mind. It is often said that a monarchy is the only institution that dies from the centre out. My thoughts of the current climate is pointed. It aligns with historical precedents, where the survival of a crown became secondary to the internal dynamics of those wearing it. Here are a few paragraphs on the structural risks to the institution, the fallout of a potential failure, and historical parallels to help frame conclusions later on. First heading: the structural risks, a hollowed out institution. The greatest risk to the Crown today is not an external revolution, but institutional irrelevance caused by internal paralysis. When a monarchy shifts its energy towards managing internal tensions rather than providing national leadership, the public mask begins to crack. In a constitutional monarchy, the sovereign's power is entirely symbolic. That symbol's value is predicated on the perception of stability. If the public perceives that the top two are more engaged in zero-sum game of personal standing than in the stewardship of the nation, the Crown ceases to be a unifying force and becomes a source of national friction. This creates a vacuum of soft power, where the institution's silence, intended to project calm, is instead interpreted as a lack of agency, or worse, a state of denial. Next heading: the stakeholder fallout, the wage of the Crown. The Crown is not just a family. It is a multi-billion-pound corporate and civil structure. Beyond the royals themselves, thousands of people, from the Duchy of Cornwall's estate managers and the household staff to the Metropolitan Police's protection units, are professionally and financially tethered to its existence. If the Crown were to fail or be significantly hollowed out, the impact would ripple through the civil service and constitution. The legal foundations of the UK, from the King's Peace in courts to the granting of royal assent, would require a total chaotic overhaul. It would be like a Brexit on steroids in terms of legislative complexity. Another group, the charitable sector. Thousands of organisations rely on the royal seal of approval for fundraising. Without the Crown's patronage, the soft power infrastructure of the UK's third sector would face a massive funding and visibility deficit. I'd like to just add here that I believe that environment is happening already and has been for some time. I don't believe for one moment that the existence of a UK royal family has in any way enabled fundraising to such an extent that the majority of the charities are doing fine. I don't believe that. I don't believe that the evidence suggests that either. But time will tell. I think they're already losing, and we have all heard of increasing numbers who are actually closing, shutting down. So that particular bullet point, I think, is being more wishful thinking than factual. And the same, I also believe, applies to this one, the Commonwealth. The Crown is the thread holding 50 plus nations voluntary associations together. Its failure would likely trigger the immediate fragmentation of this global network. My thoughts on that particular bullet point is that the Commonwealth is in need of overhaul anyway. Things need to be reviewed, see what is still required, what can be done differently, and what can be stopped altogether. So regardless of what the monarchy is doing at the moment, I believe that the Commonwealth needs to revisit a number of things. And on a personal note, I don't actually see why the UK monarchy has to be seen as the head of things in the scene. I just don't. I'll just leave it at that. We'll see what happens over the next few years. Next heading, historical precedent. The erosion from within. History shows that monarchies rarely fall because they are hated. They fall because they become functionally useless. One example, the Romanovs from Russia. In the years leading up to 1917, the internal mask was maintained, while the leadership was increasingly isolated and distracted by internal family crises. By the time the external pressure arrived, there was no internal strength left to resist it. The Bourbons from France. Louis XVI was not an evil man, but he was a leader who failed to grasp the risks of the game. He remained in a state of internal focus while the world around him shifted. The Habsburgs from Austria and Hungary. Their collapse was accelerated by a rigid adherence to all is well protocols that ignored the shifting loyalties of their diverse subjects. Next heading, the daylight theory. The famous warning from constitutional scholar Walter Bajot. Quote from him, "We must not let in daylight upon magic." End of quote. This podcast could argue that the current leaders are making a fatal mistake. They are letting in the wrong kind of daylight. Instead of the daylight of transparency and modern leadership, they are allowing the daylight of personal friction and internal erosion to be seen. Historically, once the magic of the crown is replaced by the mechanics of a family feud, the institution loses its divine justification and becomes just another expensive, dysfunctional Department of State. The economic ledger, a crown of two halves. When discussing the wage for the Crown's efforts, the numbers are often a point of fierce contention. To provide balance, it's possible to present two primary ways the Crown's cost is calculated today. The official view, the sovereign grant. For the financial year 2025 to 26, the sovereign grant is set to rise to £132.1 million, a 53% increase from the previous year. This is largely due to record profits from the Crown's estate, offshore, wind farms and the ongoing 369 million resurfacing of Buckingham Palace. In contrast, the Republican view, in brackets, the true cost, close brackets, research groups like Republic argue the true cost, is closer to £510 million per year. They include hidden costs such as the £150 million security bill, lost revenue from the Duchies of Lancaster and Cornwall, which they argue are state assets, and the costs incurred by local councils for royal visits. The game versus the stakes. The risk to the Crown isn't just that the top two are playing a dangerous game of internal politics. It's that they are playing it while standing on a financial and legal trapdoor. If the mask slips far enough that the public demands a republic, we aren't just talking about changing a face on a stamp. We are talking about a multi-billion-pound constitutional divorce at a time when the nation's cupboards are already bare. History tells us that when a monarchy goes internal, it stops earning its keep. And in 2026, an institution that costs £500 million while providing no clear leadership is an institution living on borrowed time. The lead players may love the Crown, but by failing to lead, they are essentially writing the invoice for its abolition. If the monarchy is a public mask, then the behavioural traits of its lead players are the cracks through which the public sees the reality. Here's an outline of a behavioural audit, or rather a list of behavioural traits that could be audited, that focuses on how leadership traits, or the lack thereof, translate into institutional risk. Let's have a look at a simplified version of a behavioural audit. The personality trap, when private grievance outpaces public duty. Number 1. The fortress mentality. This trait involves a retreat into a small, trusted circle, viewing any external critique or modernising suggestion as an act of betrayal. The risk. It creates an information vacuum. Historically, leaders who go internal stop receiving honest feedback. From a podcast angle and point of view, perspective, however you wish to describe it, give some thought to how this fortress behaviour would prevent or could prevent the Crown from adapting to the 21st century, making it look defensive rather than resilient. There's number 2, the legacy obsession. This is a tendency to prioritise one's future place in history or personal brand over the immediate stability of the current reign. So much I could say about that one sentence, but I will leave that to all of you to come to your own thoughts on that. I'll repeat it in case any of you missed it. The legacy obsession. This is the tendency to prioritise one's future place in history, in inverted commas, or personal brand over the immediate stability of the current reign. The risk? It creates competing narratives. When two leaders are seen to be auditioning for different versions of the monarchy, it signals a house divided. So from a podcast perspective, and all of the listeners and people who support this channel, give thought to contrast this with the late Queen Elizabeth II's trait of self-effacement, where the individual disappeared so the crown could shine. Three, the communication paradox. This is the trait of being seen but not heard, but in a way that feels manipulative rather than stoic. Using briefings and sources to fight internal battles while maintaining a silent public persona. The risk? Loss of trust. Research shows that Gen Z and millennials value authentic transparency over curated mystery. By playing the game through the press, the leads risk being seen as politicians rather than symbols. This next section is really a simplified table. One of the slides does have this table, but it'll just be a summary of it. The actual article will have more detail. But just to give a feel of what this diagram, this chart rather, looks like. The heading: the comparative analysis, the cycle of decline. To provide research-based balance, you can use a table such as this to show how certain behaviours have historically signalled the end of a regime. Across the top, the headings are behavioural trait, historical example in the second column, modern parallel or risk in the third. The first heading under behavioural trait, inaccessibility. The historical example is Louis XVI from France, and the modern parallel or risk is the public mask feeling like an invisible wall. Behavioural trait, second one, factionalism. The historical example, the War of the Roses. The modern parallel and risk, internal competition for resources and public favour. Behavioural trait, the third, reactionary delay. Historical example, Nicholas II from Russia. The modern parallel and risk, waiting too long to address game-playing risks. The last behavioural trait on this particular table, preference for flattery. The historic example, the Kaiser from Germany. And the parallel, or risk, dismissing critics as being anti-royalist rather than listening. To ensure that this podcast, and in fact the whole of this series of podcasts, is evidence-based, there are a few that I'm just going to quote in the next couple of minutes, looking at recent downward trends in institutional trust across the UK. And there are, at the end of this article, a list of reference sources with names and dates of names of people who've written research papers, the dates when they were published, and the institution that they did that study and published that study. There are some really, really good locations on there, and once you go on any of those, you'll find that they then break down into even more reference sources. So, this first one, it says, here is a breakdown of academic and sociological data that can be used to prove that the internal erosion that many suspect is already showing up in the numbers. This one is the importance deficit, and it's from the National Centre for Social Research, usually referred to in brackets as NatCen data, which produces the British Social Attitudes Survey, provides perhaps the most sobering data for the Crown. First bullet point, the historical low. As of late 2025, early 2026, support for the monarchy has hit its lowest level since records began in 1983. Next bullet, the trend. In 1983, 86% of people said it was very or quite important for Britain to have a monarchy. By 2024, that fell to 51%, and latest indicators suggest it is struggling to stay above the 50% majority mark. Next bullet, the abolition spike. For the first time, nearly 4 in 10, 38%, would prefer an elected head of state when asked to choose directly. It could be argued that while the mask projects stability, the public's belief in the necessity of the institution is evaporating. It is transitioning from a national cornerstone to an optional extra. Next heading, the generational fissure, YouGov 2026. YouGov's most recent favourability trackers in January 2026 highlighted a behavioural blind spot in the Crown's leadership. Again, it's a small table, 3 columns, the 3 headings going from left to right: group, support for monarchy, preferred elected head. First group listed is aged 18 to 24. Support for the monarchy is 30%. The percentage for those that would prefer an elected head was 59%. So just to repeat, from age 18 to 24, in this most recent audit, support for the monarchy was 30%. And in terms of preferring an elected head, 59% of the 18 to 24s would prefer an elected head of state. The next group are the over 65s, or rather 65 and above. So for the age 65 and above, for or in respect of support for the monarchy, 77% of them prefer a monarchy. No surprise there. Preferred elected head, only 15%, 15% of the over 65s want that. And I've said it many times in podcasts, and that just looking at those most recent figures, the vast majority of the British royal family is age 65 and above. I'm really not concerned about the 77% of them who want a monarchy, because, and I'll mean this in the best way, it may not come across that way, but I do mean it because it's factual. Those who are age 65 and above are not going to be the majority of the voting public in years to come. So really, when you see that the 18 to 24-year-olds are at 59% in who they would vote for in terms of a head of state, that suggests to me that the royalists, on a whole, are the age group of the royal family that they are supporting, because they're the royal family and they've all kind of grown up together. That's not how it's going to stay. It's just not. And I've said it before, at some point all of what remains of the royal families around the globe will not be there at some point. Even now, the majority of what were there are no longer in existence, so it's already on the downfall. But those figures are quite stark, and that's now. And as I said, not everybody's going to be around for that many decades in the future, but there's far more people coming up through the ranks of a different age group and who've already are stating their views. So interesting. The leadership gap. While the Prince and Princess of Wales remain popular, 74 to 77%, the King's favourability sits at 60%. And Queen Camilla's has dipped to 42%, her lowest since 2021. Yeah, those figures I think are still being quite favourable to all that they quoted there. So that's for the Prince and Princess of Wales, the King's favourability, and Camilla's score. All of them I think are very generous compared to what the reality is. That all depends on who filled in whatever forms, who they questioned. But even so, it's going to look very, very different in a decade from now onwards. This next heading, the Andrew effect. 90 to 91% of the public view Prince Andrew negatively, and refers to things which you'll see in the article in more detail of game playing theory. The King is seen by 32% of the public as having handled this internal crisis badly, suggesting the public senses the internal friction. Doesn't really seem that mask that they are, or some of them within the royal family, are pretending to wear and then send out media people to give the more hard-hitting perspectives, but the ones in the royal family sort of sit at the back with their hands behind their back saying, no, we didn't say that, that's not us, when really that's where it's come from. And even with favourable collation of data, these figures are still poor, or in some cases very generous, both extremes that I question the accuracy. But even as they stand, all of the people concerned that it's referring to should be very concerned, not bury their heads in the sand and pretend everything's all right. Sociological context: the crisis of representative institutions. Implementing versus representative trust. Globally, trust in implementing institutions like the police or the NHS is volatile. But trust in representative symbols like Parliament or the monarchy is in a steady, long-term decline across Western democracies. The neutrality trap. Academic papers often argue that monarchies survive because they are seen as neutral. This podcast could argue that lead players are currently destroying their neutrality by engaging in what the public perceives as partisan or personal internal warfare. And one paper, there's more than one, but one of the papers that has a view on this is by Bornskov in 2025. It's listed, so you'll be able to go through and look up the report if you want. But I would definitely argue that the lead players are currently destroying their neutrality by engaging in what the public perceives as partisan or personal internal warfare. Not good. I'm just reading sentences now with simple headings beforehand rather than the whole paragraph which you will find in the article. This is about the relational contract failure. One bullet point: the behavioural marker. When leaders engage in internal game playing, such as briefings, leaks, or factionalism, they are essentially breaching the contract. The risk. Research shows that hereditary systems are significantly more likely to collapse when the incumbent's performance is poor. Unlike a politician who can be voted out, a failing royal relational contract usually leads to the total rejection of the institution itself. That's heavy, that one. And I hope that as people read it through more than once, recognise the risk, definite risk that goes with that, but whether anybody in the monarchy for 1 second, never mind any longer than that to give it thought, that it may actually apply to them, and that they are the royal relational contract that they're in, that maybe has escaped their mind at the moment, because somehow they think they'll be there forever. Another trait: surface acting versus deep acting. In brackets, psychology of the mask. There are various dates of when this research was done. I'm not going to go through all of that. It's there for people that need to and would like to read more about it. Just the bullet point: the behavioural marker, high levels of surface acting, where the top two project unity but internally harbour tension, leads to emotional exhaustion and depleted leadership. The risk: a depleted leader is statistically more likely to make passive or erratic decisions. Observations of the public mask, as we've seen it, and certainly I've referred to it in podcasts in recent weeks, suggests the institution is currently in a state of high stress surface acting, which history shows is unsustainable and often precedes a public breakdown. And we have definitely had discussions about that over the last few months. That keeps cropping up. It is almost inevitable that it will happen. Whether they do it behind closed doors remains to be seen. But I definitely, my personal perspective, that I have seen a number of members of that family who are out on duty officially, and as far as I'm concerned, they're either just recovering from a breakdown or they're still in it. But they look far from healthy and at peace. And I'll just remind everyone that's listening, we've talked about this before, but the lack of safeguarding and all the rules that go with that, and all the laws that apply to everybody else that don't appear to apply to the monarchy, those are the reasons why people who are not well are out and about sometimes when they shouldn't be, and other times we don't see them anyway, so who knows whether they're well or not. There's just a lack of care, duty of care, legal requirement, which members of the royal family don't have to adhere to. And that goes for all the people that work there as well. The fortress mentality and information silos. The behavioural marker on this one, then I'll stop. I'm not doing any more of these. Is enough for you just to get the idea of how, if you wanted to conduct an audit, whether it be in your business or people that you know who have got a business, or even if you were doing an experiment on any member or members of the royal family. It gives you some ideas of how you could set it out. So the behavioural marker on this one, to do with the fortress mentality, which is retreating into a small defensive circle of people and creates an information vacuum to anyone outside of it. And the risk of that, in the absence of direct leadership, the public fills the vacuum with their own, often negative narratives. This is the daylight theory in action, which was referred to earlier on in this article. When you don't provide the right kind of light, leadership, the public lets in the wrong kind, in brackets, speculation and scandal. A quick summary of stability versus importance. And this is from a BSA survey, the British Social Attitude Survey, and who is regarded as the gold standard of UK sociological data. This refers to figures that were mentioned earlier in the article, but it's just the way it set it out in that same framework that I gave some examples of about the evidence, the behaviour and the conclusion. And it refers to evidence. As of late 2025, reports that number of people who believe it is very important to have a monarchy has reached a historic low of 51%, 5-1. The behavioural link. In 1983, this figure was 86%. The 35% drop represents a slow motion collapse of institutional necessity. And that's about the need for a royal family. And we've referred to it earlier on today and in previous podcasts. That should cause them major concern. But I doubt at the moment that they really think it matters or it's going to affect them in any way, even though it's got the word monarchy in it. The conclusion, strength. Could be argued that while the mask, the 51%, still represents a slim majority, the intensity of that support has vanished. People are indifferent, and indifference is the precursor to institutional failure. There are a number of examples in the article of some of the tables I've just gone through very quickly. Really, really interesting ones as well. But there's no point in me repeating. It was just to give you the idea of what the framework is and, if you like, the 3 or 4 bullet points that then refers to the data and gives explanation. This is not the same as the ones we've done already, but it's the only one I'm going to do on this particular front. This is about the establishment loyalty, and it's referring to where royalists generally feel very comfortable that the monarchy will always be there, if not least because the establishment will make sure that they are there. They're all sort of one and part of the same group. So this is referring to that establishment loyalty bit. To back up the argument that the establishment is a fair weather friend, it states that some people may wish to look into it in more detail to see whether or not that is in fact the case. The 1946 Italian referendum, despite the King's establishment support, the public voted for a republic because the Crown was seen as having played games during the war. The relational contract. This academic paper, and it's listed with names and dates and so on, this academic paper explains that the elite only support a hereditary leader as long as that leader maintains public order. If the public becomes indifferent or hostile, the elite will pivot to a republic to save their own positions. Interesting. I think the king and the heir, and possibly the courtiers, are in denial. And it frustrates me, that's me personally, the amount of funding which goes to people who just assume all will always be okay, regardless of what is going on and what is happening, and stats that are being quoted. There is a specific psychological phenomenon often seen in long-standing institutions called institutional narcissism, where the leadership becomes so convinced of their own necessity that they view public indifference not as a warning, but as a lack of education on the part of the public. I will just say here that we have a future podcast coming up, and that is the title of it: Institutional Narcissism. Conclusion. The king and the heir are currently banking on a loyalty that is historically transactional. The establishment isn't a bodyguard, it's a mirror. While the courtiers tell the leadership that the mask is secure, the economic data shows a nation that is increasingly unwilling to pay for the upkeep of an institution in denial. When the heir assumes the establishment will always be there, he forgets the cardinal rule of power. The elite only support a crown until it becomes a distraction. In 2026, with youth support in freefall, the crown is becoming a very expensive distraction indeed. In academic terms, institutional narcissism occurs when an organisation becomes so enamoured with its own history, prestige, and specialness that it loses the ability to process external reality. It stops being a tool for the public and becomes a shrine to its own survival. Research isn't just about opinions, it's about the science of leadership. When the data shows a 40-year low in institutional trust, it's a direct response to what psychologists call surface acting. The crown is wearing a mask that no longer fits, and as history and academia tell us, an institution that prioritises its internal gains over its public contract is an institution preparing for its own exit. A closing thought, the end of which this podcast will finish. The heir's greatest mistake is confusing the establishment with the public. The establishment is a mirror that reflects whatever the current power structure wants to see. But YouGov and the National Centre of Research data is a window into the reality outside the palace gates, and that window shows a generation that doesn't hate the king. They simply don't see the point of him. Arrogance in the face of indifference is not a strategy for survival. It is a blueprint for a quiet exit. That's the end of this week's podcast. I hope you found that interesting, informative. There's much more in the article, and as I said at the beginning, this article is quite long because it covers 2 podcasts, as I was ill with the last one. I did the podcast, but I didn't get around to finishing the article. So it's quite long, but full of detail, and I do actually think that this article will be out on Monday is worth keeping, because I very much believe that there are a number of things that have been referred to in that article and previous ones that we've done in recent months. Things are going to start happening, and you could almost tick them off as being, yeah, that was on the list, that's happened now, and so on. A number of things are going to be going on in the next few years. So thank you very much for being here. Thank you very much for listening, even through all the ones that I was doing, quoting figures and from the tables and trying to make them as interesting as possible. The better off when you actually look at the article and read it for yourself. But thank you for your support, particularly when I was not well, and I'm not in good health as a general thing at the moment, as you all know, so it will be up and down, but I'll do my best to keep this going. So, to say thank you and look forward as usual to your comments Sunday night onwards, So it's bye from me, bye from Ivy, bye.